I said, by presenting these documents to me only in Russian and saying you want to negotiate them in 48 hours, do you have any idea how long it's going to take for me to have these translated so that the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense can read them and understand them if we were to, and I'm confident we won't, meet you in Geneva in 48 hours? And that was one example where the issue of interpretation or translation, they did that intentionally.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of GNSI's Video Series. I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer, the Strategy and Research Manager here at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. Today, we're joined by Ambassador John J. Sullivan. He's the former Deputy Secretary of State, as well as the former ambassador to the Russian Federation from February 2020 until September 2022. He is currently the partner at Mayor Brown's Washington, D.C. and New York offices. He's also a distinguished scholar at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and a distinguished fellow at Columbia University. Today, we will discuss his recently published book, Midnight in Moscow, a memoir from the front lines of Russia's war against the West. But going back to the beginning, so you asked Secretary Pompeo, hey, I think I want to be ambassador to Russia. President Trump asked you, you note in the book, President Trump's like, you sure you really want to do this?
Right.
You tell him yes, and then you're confirmed as ambassador. So how did you prepare for this role? I mean, throughout the book, you talk about Kennan's long telegram,
Right.
X article, all these things. So how did you prepare?
So I was really privileged because I was deputy secretary. I had access to a lot of materials and briefers, individuals at the State Department, across the intelligence community, at DIA, NSA.
Mm-hmm.
I spent the fall of 2019 getting briefed, prepared to serve in Moscow. If I had been coming in from the private sector, if I had not been serving in government, at that point I probably would not have had my security clearance yet, and I wouldn't have the ease of access in getting people either to come to me to brief me or to go to their offices or headquarters. So I spent the better part of, I got confirmed in mid-December, and I spent the better part of, and I had my confirmation hearing on, I think it was October 30th. I spent from October 30th through, and basically November and December, preparing for service in Moscow, getting briefed on embassy operations, current challenges at the embassy, security problems, logistical problems, bigger picture issues, Ukraine, North Korea, you name it. So I was pretty well briefed when I arrived. But an interesting thing, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, I think I do in the book. What really I took advantage of was when I arrived and I was in Moscow for only a few months when the pandemic hit, and there was a substantial lockdown in Moscow, across Russia, but including Moscow, starting at the end of March of 2020. And it was one of the two major events that occurred when I was ambassador were the pandemic and the war. And the pandemic obviously happened first, and it had a huge impact on me personally because I could no longer meet in person with any Russian government officials. Everything was done virtually, either by phone, not video, by phone. Occasionally, if the Russians were annoyed with us, they would make us communicate by fax. There were some old agreements entered into in the 90s that had specified that if notice is to be given by one side to the other, it shall be given by facsimile transmission. And if they were particularly annoyed, I mean, who sends faxes these days? If they were particularly annoyed with us and wanted to make our lives difficult, they would insist that we follow the terms of the agreement, dust off one old fax machine that we continued to have to keep, and send them a fax. But I had no social events to go to. We were trying to, like the NHL and the NBA, create our own little bubble, limit the number of people who would come onto the compound to protect ourselves during the pandemic. So I had a lot of time on my hands as ambassador, and I basically lived during the day, worked in the station. In the CIA has publicly identified a station, a chief of station at our embassy in Moscow and virtually every other embassy around the world. And our CIA station chief and I became very, very good friends, spent a lot of time together. And I'd spend hours every day up there reading, getting briefed by analysts and officers back at Langley. And I, courtesy of the U.S. intelligence community, I basically took participated. It was like going to graduate school in Putin and the Russian Federation, because it extended well into 2021. And so I probably spent as much time as any American ambassador ever has working with the agency, just because of my own curiosity and my desire to know as much as I could about Putin, about his government, and Russia.
Well, in the book, you often refer to Putin's strategy. He's kind of how he conducts himself as a Chekist. Is it during this time you developed this idea that he's a Chekist? And could you kind of tell us how that came about?
So he is a self-identified Chekist. So the Cheka it's a Russian acronym. The Cheka was established at the start of the Russian Revolution in December 1917. And it was the original, it's the predecessor to the KGB and the FSB. It's the original secret police established by Lenin. And the first head of the Cheka, the head of the Cheka, establishing the Cheka, was, ironically, a Pole, Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was descended from Polish Catholic nobility, became a communist, Bolshevik, and he established the Cheka with the full support of Lenin. And the role of the Cheka was to protect and promote the revolution. So to protect the revolution in the person of Lenin himself, and to eliminate enemies of the revolution, class enemies, those who were hostile to the revolution. The Cheka wasn't bound by law, by morals, by religion, by ethics. The animating purpose of the Cheka was to protect Lenin and the revolution and eliminate threats, enemies to the revolution. So it spawned the Red Terror. Thousands of people killed, executed, extrajudicial punishment. These weren't people who were prosecuted and convicted and then executed. They were simply executed. The Cheka has a pedigree. It dates all the way back to Ivan the Terrible, who had they were called the Oprichniki, who were basically the palace guard of the Tsar. And like the Cheka, the Oprichniki, their only reason to exist, they were only bound by what the Tsar wanted and protecting the person of the Tsar and enemies of the Tsar. They weren't bound by law. They weren't bound by the church, by morals, etc. and so the original Chekists go back to the reign of Ivan the Terrible, called the Oprichniki. Subsequent czars, particularly in the late 19th century, created the Okhrana, again, the Tsar's secret police. But the apotheosis, really the height of the police state in Russia and the Soviet Union is the Cheka. To this day, and I'm going to forget the precise date, in December, Russia celebrates Chekist Day. Putin celebrates it. The Cheka ultimately morphs into various forms: NKVD, KGB, and as I said earlier, it exists today in the form of the FSB and the smaller SVR. Putin began his professional life as a KGB officer in what was then Leningrad in the mid-'70s, and he was imbued with this Chekist culture. He wasn't a superstar in the KGB. In the 80s he was assigned to the it's called the Residentura, the KGB outpost in East Germany in Dresden, and he was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB. If he'd been a real hotshot, he probably would have been Colonel Putin in East Berlin. But he himself has said, now looking back on his career and his origin as in the KGB, he said it's almost like an organized crime figure. He says there's no such thing as a former KGB man. Once you're in the organization, you're in for life. So what does that mean for Russia that their president is a Chekist? He is ultimately, first of all, he himself embodies the state the way the Tsar did, the way the general secretary of the Communist Party did, whether it was Lenin or all the way to Gorbachev. And he's not bound by law, by morals, by the church, only what's right for him and the state, for him as head of the state. It's an organization now, the FSB, and a mindset that's really foreign to Westerners. But that's how he developed over decades as a KGB officer. And he once joked that when he ultimately went into municipal government in what became St. Petersburg, and then succeeded into more significant roles in Moscow as first head of the FSB and then prime minister and president, he joked at one point that he and a small group had been tasked by the KGB as the Soviet Union was dissolving, to penetrate whatever the new government was and to keep the Chekist legacy alive. He told that as a joke. I don't think it's a joke.
And part of their characteristics is that kind of cool, calm demeanor, and it's this confidence, it's this kind of sly lingo. So you know this going in many ways, and you had a couple opportunities to meet Putin.
Yeah.
So what's that like? What's it like to meet the this figure that we hear so much about?
Yeah, so I spent a fair amount of time with him, not just as ambassador, but even before then. I was with Vice President Pence. Met with him on a trip to Asia. I think it was the East Asia Leaders Summit, and I was with the vice president when he met with Putin, and then the leaders. Pence, the vice president, represented, of course, President Trump, but the other participants were leaders, and Pence sat near Putin at this round table. I sat behind Pence, but I sat very close to Putin. I watched him for basically an afternoon. It was fascinating to see how he comported himself and engaged with his staff. So he very much tries to embody that KGB tough guy legacy.
Mhm.
And I can make a comparison to, I think early on in my book, a character in the movie Goodfellas, who's played by Paul Sorvino, and the
Mhm.
character Big Paulie. And the narrator says about Big Paulie that Big Paulie didn't move fast because Big Paulie didn't have to move for anybody. And that's sort of the attitude that Putin has. It is, I guess the best way to describe it is his attitude toward anyone and everyone he encounters is, I'm the president of the Russian Federation. Beyond that, I'm Vladimir Putin. You are, you are nothing to me. And he made that clear, he made that clear to me, but not in an offensive way. Just his whole demeanor when we would talk about an issue, he would tell me what he thought, and it basically conveyed the message that, I'll give you an example. He said, I think, this is Putin speak, I think President Trump should come to our Victory Day celebration on May
Mhm.
9th, 2020. It wound up a big parade in Red Square, which is a propaganda spectacle for Putin and the Kremlin. It wound up being postponed because of the pandemic, but he wanted as many world leaders as possible to come. It was commemorating the 75th anniversary of the end of what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War,
Mhm.
the Second World War. And he really, really wanted Trump to come. It would be a huge, huge coup for him if he could get the American president to come and sit with him above Lenin's tomb and watch this parade. But as I write in the book, if you're a Chekist, if you were Putin, the last thing you want to show is that you really want something.
Mhm.
In fact, you do the opposite, which is, I think it would be great if President Trump came, but if he doesn't want to come, okay, that's
Right.
fine. That's sort of the more he wants something, the less he'd be willing to show that he wants it.
And oftentimes, when you were talking as ambassador to Russian officials, you're using interpreters. You have other advisors in the room. So, what's that like when you're meeting with Russian officials? You're having to, often again go through interpreters, go
Right.
through other advisors. What's that like as the
Well, more
ambassador?
often than not, the senior Russian government officials, including Putin
Mhm.
speaks some English and
Mhm.
understands English, but would only use an interpreter in engaging with an American president
Mhm.
or, an underling like the American ambassador. So whenever I spoke with him, or whenever he speaks to the American president or Vice President Pence, it was always with an interpreter, but he speaks and understands English. He's fluent in German and would speak with Angela Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, in German, and his German is very good. His English is not very good, but he does speak and understand it. Most Russians are like that. Most Russians, the senior Russian government officials I engage with, speak or understand English. Some would use an interpreter, others wouldn't. Um, but the amusing thing that and it became significant in the run up to the war is, on speaking of language and translation, it's the diplomatic practice when the United States submits a document on behalf of our country to the Russian Foreign Ministry, an official U.S. document. It's always in our official language, which is English. But as a courtesy, we always provide a copy translated into Russian. And similarly, when the Russians would present to me a document on behalf of the Russian Federation, it would be presented in Russian with a courtesy copy translated into English. The only time they didn't do that was in December of 2021, just months before the special military operation began. They summoned me to the foreign ministry, along with our assistant secretary was for European affairs was was in Moscow at the time too, and they summoned us, and they gave us 2 draft treaties, one purporting to be between the United States and Russia, and the other between NATO and Russia. And they were short. I described them in the book. They weren't drafted to start or jumpstart negotiations. They were basically press releases, maximalist demands that the Russians wanted. But what I noticed was they presented copies only in Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And they also said, we want to negotiate these treaties with the United States. It was a Wednesday. We want to negotiate these documents with the United States in Geneva on Friday in 48 hours. You know, I had a lot of questions. You know, why is this a crisis? What do you mean 48 hours? Why? And they couldn't answer. They just said, look, it was all about Ukraine, of course. Well, it was broader than that. It was about NATO. It was about what they called the security architecture in Europe. They said, look, Ukraine it's an existential threat to the Soviet Union, to the Russian Federation. Our president has made that clear. We can't wait any longer. We need to get security guarantees for us in the form of these treaties. We want to negotiate these with you in 48 hours in Geneva. If you don't come, we will release these drafts publicly, and people can draw their own conclusions about who wants peace and who doesn't in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And I noted that, I said, by presenting these documents to me only in Russian and saying you want to negotiate them in 48 hours, do you have any idea how long it's going to take for me to have these translated so that the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense can read them and understand them if we were to, and I'm confident we won't, meet you in Geneva in 48 hours? And that was one example where the issue of interpretation or translation, they did that intentionally to delay our ability to, for those who don't speak or read Russian to understand the draft treaties. It was all part of their version of what we would call public diplomacy, propaganda, to create the impression that they were interested in diplomacy when in fact they weren't. And finally, on my experience with them, when I would present documents to them, and I would present the official copy in English and the courtesy copy, not the official copy, but the courtesy copy in Russian, they would delight in taking the Russian version and going through it and correcting our Russian and correcting our grammatical errors, including when so they presented me those draft treaties in mid-December of 21. Must have been late January, early February of 22, right before the war. I presented a significant letter that Secretary Blinken wrote to Foreign Minister Lavrov, and I presented it to the Russian government. It was at night, delivered it to the foreign ministry, official copy in English, courtesy copy in Russian. The Russians wouldn't engage me on the substance of the letter. There was a group of them sitting across the table from me, but they took out their red pens and were marking up the Russian translation and chuckling as to how we had mangled some translation into their language.
It's interesting. And in midnight in Moscow, you mentioned a number of these different, signals the Russians are doing, maybe delaying tactics, maybe just trying to show, hey, we're indifferent about negotiations, whatever it may be. But when we're talking about the run up to the war, so let's talk a little bit about, that initial startup really starts not long after President Biden assumes office, and you're retained on. You're not. President Trump comes out of office, President Biden comes in and retains you as ambassador, which is amazing. That's awesome. You discuss the details of that throughout the book. And really not long after Biden takes office, we start seeing signs of the Russian tensions with Russia, particularly with, for example, an interview with Biden on March 17, 2021, where he agrees that Putin is a killer.
Mhm.
And so this has, as you go to great detail, this has a lot of ramifications for your mission in Moscow. So how did that, just that comment sparked a lot of Russian pushback, and Putin ends up challenging Biden to a debate.
Yes. No, it was a rough spring, the spring of 21 in U.S. Russia relations, because the new team had come in. President Biden had come into office, and President Trump in the Trump 45 administration had been pretty tough on Russia, sanctions and so forth. And the Biden administration was continuing that and ratcheting up sanctions. So we were going to impose sanctions for further election interference, cyber attacks, Navalny being arrested upon his return to Russia in January of 21. So there's some, the Russians are viewing us warily, the new administration. What's going to happen in the spring when the United States announces whatever our sanctions are going to be for the SolarWinds cyber hack or the arrest of Navalny? In the midst of that, so it's a tense time. You're right. President Biden gave an interview to George Stephanopoulos of ABC News, and it was very interesting. Stephanopoulos was interviewing the president, and just as sort of an aside, he said to the president, and Putin's a killer, right? And President Biden said, President Biden didn't use the word killer, but just agreed, yeah, you'd agree, President Biden's a killer, yeah. So the Russians feigned outrage. Putin recalled immediately his ambassador to the Russian ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov. I stayed. I had I was not instructed, had no plan to return to the United States. So from mid-March until the United States finally announced, the new administration announced its sanctions on Russia in mid-April, a month later. So I'm there for a month while the Russian ambassador is home in Moscow. And the Biden administration announces sanctions, expels some Russian diplomats, et cetera, in mid-April. The Russians respond, and among their responses was a request that I leave Moscow. And Putin mentioned it to President Biden in a phone call. He said something to the effect of, and you should just, bring your ambassador home from Moscow, because he's not going to have anything to do. No one in government will speak with him. So you should just bring him home. Because I had asked, when the Russians said that to me, I said, are you expelling me? Are you declaring me persona non grata? And I mentioned that to, I think it was Yuri Yushakov. I asked Yuri Yushakov, who's former ambassador, Russian ambassador to the United States, foreign policy advisor to Putin. And Yuri had said, you really should go home. And I said, well, are you expelling me? Are you declaring me persona non grata? And he was startled. He said, oh God, no, of course not. No, but you should go home. So there was a debate. What do we do? And finally, because of the pandemic, I hadn't been home in 13 months and seen my family. So I hadn't met with the new, you mentioned that President Biden kept me as ambassador. So I stayed through the transition, and I hadn't met in person with, I knew him because I succeeded him as deputy secretary, the new Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, Jake Sullivan at the White House, the president himself. I hadn't met with the new administration. So I came home at the end of April and went with President Biden, because in April, things, we imposed sanctions, expelled Russians. The Russians responded. We, the United States, proposed a meeting of Biden with Putin, and that was finally scheduled for mid-June in Geneva. I was home, and I was home in the United States from the end of April until that meeting in June. And I went with President Biden when he met with Putin. And then one of the deliverables, the so-called deliverables, one of the outcomes of that meeting was an agreement by the two presidents that they would send their respective ambassadors back to their posts. So I went back to Moscow, and Ambassador Antonov returned to Washington.
And it's interesting because in the backdrop of all of the things you just mentioned during the initial incoming Biden administration, so from February 2021 to about May of 2021, the Russians are building up on the Ukrainian border. So this is the first buildup. It's a huge buildup to roughly 80,000 Russian troops. They're pulling in a lot of equipment. They're doing exercises. They're building infrastructure.
Yep.
And you know in the book that you said this is very strange because it's not just exercises. They're doing a lot. And when those soldiers return back to their home stations, they left a lot of equipment.
Yep.
And they really had a lot of stuff pre-staged. So at that point, were you concerned of a possible reboot of conflict?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there was a debate among NATO capitals about whether this was going to whether the Russians really were going to invade. And it was publicly discussed. I think the assessment by the the assessment by the United States was at that point, April, May of 2021, the consensus was that the Russians were not going to. But other NATO allies, their intelligence services, MI6 for the UK, disagreed. So it was the backdrop to all that engagement between Moscow and Washington and the meeting of Biden with Putin. There was this military buildup by the Russians in southwestern Russia and Crimea. But I think among the most important things to note, and as I look back on it now, I think it's significant. It's for the United States, when I was ambassador, either under President Trump or President Biden, until the fall of 2021, Ukraine was not my highest priority.
Right.
I was not instructed, by God, we've got to do something about this problem with Ukraine. In fact, our posture, including into the Biden administration, as late as October of 2021, mid-October, was the Germans and the French have the lead on this through, they helped broker the so-called Minsk agreements in 2014-15 that had stopped major combat operations when the Russians first invaded Crimea and then into the Donbass. The Germans and the French had the lead. We wanted to support them. We wanted to see a resolution of the problem in Ukraine, but we didn't want to supplant the German chancellor or the French president. Putin met with Macron and Merkel in December of 2019, just as I was getting confirmed as ambassador. It was the last meeting in that format. It with Zelensky. So the four: Merkel, Macron, Zelensky, and Putin in Paris. But Ukraine wasn't the highest U.S. priority. We had a lot of other things.
Right.
We were extending the New START treaty.
Right.
Do we? And for how long? Wrongfully detained Americans, cyber attacks, election interference,
visa issues.
Right? So, and even when Biden meets with Putin in June of 2021, they spent more time talking about Afghanistan than they did about Ukraine.
Wow.
Because at that point, Biden had announced in the spring that the U.S., following on what President Trump had committed, the U.S. would withdraw the U.S. military from Afghanistan. The plan was no later than September 11th. And in June of 21, one of the priorities for the administration was trying to maintain the counterterrorism the ability to engage in our counterterrorism mission in South Asia, particularly in Afghanistan. How are we going to continue to do that against the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Afghanistan, Taliban, et cetera, if we were losing all of our military platforms there? So the quest was for a counterterrorism platform in Central Asia.
Hmm.
And that's what Biden raised with Putin. And Putin wanted nothing to do with it. I write in the book,
Sure.
Putin cracks a joke about it. That no way they were going to tolerate a U.S. military presence in Central Asia. But they spent more time talking about that than they did about Ukraine.
What an intriguing episode of GNSI's video series. Today we're joined by former Ambassador John J. Sullivan, who was the ambassador to Russia during the initial stages of that country's invasion of Ukraine. As always, I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer here with the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. Thank you for joining us today, and please tune in to our next episode of our video series.